You're listening to Season 1 of Ding Dong Darkness Time. If this is your first time joining us, we hope you'll check out all the other episodes of this season, each one delving into the dark side of the arts. If you love it, tell the world. In the meantime, let's take a little trip, shall we? And hello, everybody. Welcome to the season finale of Ding Dong Darkness Time as we wrap up our exploration of various dark arts. Harry Potter still has not made an appearance, nor shall he, unless Chris has something up his sleeve.
I don't. I'm just happy we didn't get canceled yet.
Yes.
We made it to the end of the season. They didn't just do a pilot run and tell us, you know what, thanks, but no thanks.
Or we didn't get even one of those really embarrassing cancellations where they just cut you off in the middle of the episode.
Mid-season.
Or mid-season, right?
Oh, in the middle of the episode, they just cut the mic.
Cut the mic.
Power down.
Yeah, we're doing okay. We're
still standing.
We did, if you haven't listened to the previous episodes of the season,
shame on you.
Yes, exactly. We welcome you to go back and do so. You will learn a lot of things about paintings and sculpture and architecture and a poor attempt at explaining part of music theory.
The devil's interval.
Yeah, but through it all, we had good times, and the good times will continue. And we thought that as we covered various aspects of artwork, we had to include dance. And what immediately popped to my mind when I was thinking of dance was something that I learned recently in my studies of the Black Death back in the medieval Europe period. These dancing plagues, dancing mania episodes that spans, the first earliest incident was documented in the 7th century, but they continued off and on throughout Europe until about the 1700s or thereabouts. And I found that fascinating. We're going to do a bit of a dive into it, but I first want to say that this topic was originally on a show list for a future season that I want to do on mass hysteria or psychogenic illness events, because there are a lot of them. It is a very, very deep vein to mine for material, especially for this type of show. So look out for that in the future. We're going to really be exploring a lot of these as we go, and this is but one example. And I will probably be referring back to this episode in those shows because we're going to lay some groundwork, I think, that we can definitely carry forward and that maybe you will use in your own journeys in exploring both the background on this or any other mass hysteria events that you are familiar with.
It was amazing in researching this episode how many things came up. And I had a few things in mind, but the more examples that I saw, I was like, oh my goodness, the prevalence is much more than I had even expected. And it's not all historical. There are some very recent examples as well.
Yeah. And we are absolutely not free of this particular phenomenon as a society or as a human species. I don't know that we ever will be. We will touch on some contemporary examples of mass hysteria. I hate to keep using that word, but I feel like it is probably the more prevalent of them. I will say psychogenic events or mass psychogenic events. There are a lot of terms that fall under this umbrella, mass madness, shared madness, things like that. Chris, though, has a list of terms referring to this particular version of it, the dancing plagues, but they're dancing manias. There are so many other words. What are they, Chris?
Oh, goodness. So, I mean, one of the older ones, I think around the time that this phenomena happened or shortly after, was chorea, which means dancing in Latin, and you are like dancing mania. And Allison, you said you heard chorea mania.
Yeah.
Right, which makes sense. So that's one of them. Also, in addition to the ones Allison mentioned, there's functional movement disorder, there's hyperkinetic movement disorder, mass psychogenic illness, hysterical contagion, and even, it's kind of a branch, I feel, of a somatoform disorder.
Yes.
Which we can talk about, sometimes called psychosomatic disorders, but I think really the parlance of our times now, at least within the realm of psychology and the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, is somatoform.
Absolutely. And that boils down to the mind creating the physical symptoms of a particular illness. People tend to use that to invalidate someone's experience with a disease, but that's incorrect. A somatoform illness, when you're still experiencing the physical symptoms of something, is no less valid or miserable for the person experiencing it than if you had a physiological diagnosis of that particular illness.
Right. In some ways, it's more challenging because there is no medical explanation. If you have hypochondria or hypochondriasis, as it's often referred to, you would go to the doctor because you are experiencing illness, and yet there's no actual physical or medical cause for it. That can be very frustrating, and it could really affect any part of the body. So it's not just like something mental. I have headaches. It's not like my leg hurts. Like there could be any number of manifestations of these somatoform disorders or this feeling of illness or unwellness. Another good example is body dysmorphic disorder, where you have a very distorted sense of yourself. You may see yourself as too big, too small, too whatever, and that distortion often leads to some pretty drastic measures that the individual might take to counter this misperception of how they look.
Absolutely. And to use my own personal example, I have dealt with anxiety and depression off and on throughout my adult life and possibly my younger life. But when my anxiety levels are being untreated or when they're higher than average, I don't have panic attacks as such. I tend to have symptoms that mimic things like appendicitis, heart attack, or other pains and aches, things that I tend to think of as impending doom events with my body. And the symptoms feel very real, very physical. And one of the last bad incidents that I had of this, I really was convinced that I was having a heart attack or some heart disorder. Went and had the full workup. My heart was perfectly healthy. But after they ruled everything else out, we looked at my deep family history of anxiety and depression disorders and decided to treat for that. And a lot of people say, oh, we're good. You're just being written off and saying that you have anxiety because we can't figure out what's wrong with you. And while that is a valid concern for a lot of people, in my case, that ended up being the culprit. Once we started treating my anxiety, those physical symptoms went away. And so don't rule that out. Your mind has a very mysterious and powerful ability to make your body think it's dying if things aren't firing properly. So with that in mind, and with it in mind that our brains can make us do some things that are beyond explanation, imagine one of your favorite songs comes on the radio. And it's something that gets your foot tapping, your shoulders shaking, possibly even threatens to slam your twerk button with the power of like 75 thrusting badonkadonks. And, you're just wanting to work it. For me, it's like Earth, Wind and Fire or some disco tune coming on at work. I don't know what it is about that kind of music, but it just has a bop to it. You just, it's fun. It's bouncy. It's got a groove to it. And it's not just me. It's customers in the store of all ages. Everybody reacts when like the Bee Gees comes on. It is you just fall into the groove of it. And it's a small controlled version of what we're about to talk about. So take that one step further. Oh, maybe more than one step, probably 50 steps further. And imagine being taken by the urge to thrust that badonkadonk for not a minute or two, but hours, days, or even months. Until you are throwing that ass back and keel over from pure exhaustion or just utter death. Imagine being that taken by the Bee Gees or ABBA or Usher, whatever your preferred dancing music is. And you can't stop doing it. And your feet are bloody and your body is completely wasting away, but you can't stop dancing. This is what happened in the village of Strasbourg, Alsace, which is now modern day France, back in the year 1518. It started on a July night when a young woman, many believe to be named Frau Trophea, I think that was the pronunciation. She began to dance for no apparent reason. And it went on for many hours. People started to become concerned. They were like, what's gotten into her, you know? Then other townsfolk started joining in. And they found themselves being taken by this same compulsion to keep going. Even as, again, their feet were bloodied, they're sweating, their eyes are bulging, apparently with fear and anxiety, according to many of the accounts of this event. Again, they were gripped by a compulsion to keep going. And I think we really also should dissect the word compulsion a little bit, because I think people throw that word around sometimes. And in the psychological version or definition of the word, compulsion is defined by repetitive behaviors or mental acts that a person feels driven to perform in response to an obsession. So the behavior is supposed to reduce the distress related to the obsession. Again, people throw around OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, as, you know, they almost say it playfully, like, oh, I can't stop cleaning my countertops. I have OCDs. But it's a little more complicated than that, right?
Right. It's not just being a neat freak.
Right.
You know, it's something, it's to the point where it is, you know, in a clinical sense, it is actually debilitating. It is disrupting your daily life. It is causing some kind of distress to you or others. And the obsession part, just to clarify, is also, that's the thoughts and feelings. Those are the often invasive thoughts about what you need to do, which then drives the compulsion. And it ends up being kind of this cycle, right? Especially with OCD. If the compulsion reduces the anxiety, when the obsession returns, the compulsion is then used to calm it, and then the recycle. And then the cycle just goes on and on.
Yeah, they feed into one another. And the compulsion, which is meant to relieve the distress from the obsession, oftentimes causes over time physical pain. So it's not enough to override the urge, and it doesn't really lessen the obsession. If anything, the thought of not being able to perform your compulsive act to alleviate the obsession just sort of amps everything up. So for instance, if someone does have a true compulsion to wash their hands dozens or hundreds of times a day, you know, their hands are going to be cracked and bleeding. Their skin is going to be so raw and tender, and yet they keep doing it. It's not enough to stop them. And that's including also the scrutiny and criticisms that they're getting from friends, family, and coworkers. It's interrupting their life. It dictates who they see and where they go. That interfering with daily life and activities is one of the big markers of a disorder. So the compulsion calls, and I state that because this event, you know, these people were dancing until their feet were cut open and bleeding. Their limbs and their muscles were completely wasted away and worn out. It wasn't enough. Their bodies quite literally gave out on them.
Yeah, the report is some even died from strokes or heart attacks because of the sheer exhaustion that they pushed themselves to, or maybe didn't even push themselves, could not control.
Right. And I would even say you can even add in dehydration, starvation. If any of these people had some sort of blood sugar disorder, I'm sure people had diabetes back then. Maybe it wasn't well known or understood, but I imagine if you had a diabetic disorder and were engaging in this kind of physical activity and not eating, your blood sugar is going to plummet. Your liver is going to give out. I mean, there's so many different metabolic things that can go wrong for you. Also, lactic acid and lactic ketoacidosis, like all these, or rhabdomyolysis. That's another one where your muscles quite literally just break down and waste away, and they dump tons of lactic acid into your bloodstream, and that kills you. That is a not common affliction, but it is an affliction seen in people who do a lot of CrossFit or other similar very hardcore physical activities nonstop, and they're not watching their electrolytes. And so these things happen today. And so I imagine back then, quite possibly if you're also dealing with a population that is living during the plagues and famines of the Middle Ages, they don't have the nutrition really to start with to be doing this kind of activity. It's gonna wear them down even faster and could very likely result in death. And the death count varies. There is some controversy there as to how many people were dying from this particular plague. It went on for a few months. It went from July to September. Mm-hmm. And some say 15 people a day were dying. And then others adjust that downward. It really depends. It's, again, some of those higher death counts were compiled and written several years after the event, so they could be off. Who knows? But I have no doubt personally that a good number of people probably did perish from the exertion of doing this. Whether that's 15 people total, it's still a lot, in my opinion, even if the number of participants ranged in the, couple or up to 400 in some estimates.
And Allison, I'm curious, what did the city do when they noticed that this was continuing? Did you see what their response was? Well, it was twofold. Do you know what their initial response was?
Well, wasn't it that they decided to add musicians too?
And build a stage.
They built a stage and brought in musicians, thinking that similar to if you have a fire that's raging out of control, you add more fuel to it in the hopes that it burns out faster. But they were probably thinking, yeah, maybe we just change the beat of the music. Maybe we increase or decrease the tempo to either wear them out faster or just get them out of the trance that they were in. And wonder of wonders, it didn't work.
It did not work.
If anything, It brought more people to the party, as happens when you're in your groove and other people join and they just, start bringing the beers, bringing more to the party.
Bringing the friends, right? Hey,
yeah.
I heard about this rager downtown. Yeah,
exactly. And I mentioned trance because I do believe that a lot of people that were witnessing this, that's what they likened it to. These people were in a sort of trance when they were doing this. And I can imagine if you weren't being personally taken by this dance fever that was happening, it had to be pretty horrifying just to watch these people be completely oblivious to the consequences of what they were doing, or the absurdity of it in a way too, because I think they had started dancing when there wasn't even any music. So they brought more music over, and it just amplified the whole situation. And then imagine if you too start feeling the urge to join in once the musicians show up. You're like, oh, it's legit now. We're all dancing and music, so let's just join. And then all of a sudden you're in it. It's horrifying to think about.
And once this happens, the town, or at least it's unclear who did this, but I'm assuming this is town officials.
Yeah.
Try a different tactic, which is effectively to grab these people up and take them away to a mountaintop shrine to pray for absolution.
Yes.
So basically the idea is that these folks have been taken by spirits, by, a supernatural force, and we need to pray for them to overcome, this mania that they're experiencing.
And if I recall, I think it did work for some of them.
Well, I think part of the thing, in researching mass hysteria, one of the ways that you control for it is you separate the people who are experiencing the symptoms, the hysteria, from people who are not. Part of it is not giving the reinforcement that what they're doing is acceptable or preferred or just being validated. And it's not like people are thinking, I'm validated, I will continue to dance now, right? It's an unconscious thing. So part of it is not reinforcing that behavior and separating them from other people you have to imagine the first few days, Frau Trophia is dancing out there. People are probably like, what is the town Looney Tune doing? What is she up to?
Right.
But then at a certain point, someone's like, if a week goes by, you're like, wait, something's going on here. And we're going to talk, this city was not prospering when this happened. This was not high times in Strasbourg. And she's like, oh, because of my wealth and success, I must dance.
Right.
Quite the opposite. And Allison, you mentioned this earlier, famine.
Yes.
Disease, plague. This was not a great time.
Oh, God. Europe, honestly, from probably the 8th or 9th century up through the 18th century was an absolute catastrophe of a situation.
This is the Holy Roman Empire. We are basically in the middle of 1,000 years of the Holy Roman Empire, from the year 800 to 1806.
Right.
That is how long the HRE lasted.
And so much of it was about or dealing with the various plagues. There were a lot of them. And I'll get back to that in a second, because this particular incident in Strasbourg was absolutely not the first.
Nope.
One of the first documented major incidents of dancing mania comes about 2 centuries prior to the one in Strasbourg in Aachen, Germany. And they found that nearly 650 people participated in that one. They left their homes and went to the center of town and started writhing and twirling uncontrollably in the streets, many of them dropping dead. So this was in the 1300s. And similar outbreaks would occur throughout Europe over the next several centuries. And one of the earliest ones also seems to have come from later on in the 13th century, where something like 30 kids left their village where they were living, and they danced and they jumped and hooted and hollered like crazy all the way for like 13 or 15 miles between the village they lived in and another one. And it mimicked very weirdly the story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, which actually originated during that time period. For those not familiar, that's where the guy plays the flute to lead the rats out of town, and he does that, but then they don't pay him, and so he does the same thing, but he lures all the children out of town to be drowned in a lake. So
uplifting story.
Yeah, isn't it great? It would be great actually to talk a little more in future episodes about the Grimm's, the Brothers Grimm, and all those things that originated in that part of the world during that time period. Some very creepy stories. And again, I think heavily influenced by the existential shit show that was living in medieval Europe.
That's the technical term, folks. Existential shit show.
Yes, I coined it. I'm sticking to it.
That was my nickname in high school, wasn't it?
I thought it was mine, but I mean, we had a lot in common in high school.
That's right. Joined at the hip.
So in Aachen, Germany, they basically had a lot of people saying this was demonic possession, and the doctors, and I think even at the Strasbourg incident, they were calling it, I love this term so much. The medical term that they used was hot blood.
Hot-blooded. Check it and see.
Yeah, exactly. Got a fever of 103. We're not going to get a copyright violation because we're just speaking those lyrics.
Yeah, didn't they suggest that you could basically dance the fever away?
Yes.
I think is what they said, literally. Like, hey, you can just gyrate it out.
So that came from a version of this that popped up in Italy, which was due to people getting spider bites. And so they told people to get the venom out of you was to dance it out. And they called it tarantism, which is not to be confused with compulsively watching every film made by Quentin Tarantino in a single weekend, which is a whole other...
it's another compulsion. Listen.
Exactly. We could call it tarantism. It's modern day tarantism. It was this hot blood situation. And of course, back in those days, if they thought you had an affliction of the blood, what did they do?
Bloodletting.
Yes. So they would just drain it all out of you. And I guess they thought it would magically be replenished. Oh, wait, you died.
Is this the time of Hippocrates and the bodily humors? Or does that come later?
I think that came earlier. But we're looking at about the same time. But I think the humors and everything, that was, that was way earlier. I almost feel like that was around like the 2nd century or something like that. I would have to look that up.
I'm gonna Google that shit.
Yeah, Google it. Get back to us and let us know with the actual facts on that, because those treatments were being used throughout the Black Plagues.
Oh, sweet Maria. He's a Greek physician.
Yeah.
From 460 to 370 BCE.
Okay. So
slightly preceded by, I don't know, 2,000 years.
Yeah, just a little bit. I mean, that quote unquote conventional wisdom of the time went on for many, many centuries. And of course, exacerbated more problems than it ever solved, which is why the doctors of the time, while the Black Plagues were raging through Europe, their craft was now considered little better than basic witchcraft. No offense to the witches of the world.
You should do a season on old-timey medical procedures.
Oh, that is absolutely on the list. And
put it on the docket, sister.
I keep mentioning the Black Plagues. And by the way, I would love to recommend one of the most fantastic resources you will ever encounter on that topic. It is a book called The Great Mortality by John Kelly. And if you want to listen to that, it's on Audible. It's actually narrated really well by this kind of old British guy. It just makes it sound even more sinister than it already is. Or you can listen to the 5-part series on the Black Plague over at Last Podcast on the Left. They use Kelly's book as a main source, and it is by far one of the most comprehensive and nightmare-inducing illustrations of life for Europeans during this time period. And it manages to give a much clearer picture of humanity's responses to our current plague, which, suffice it to say, we haven't changed all that much, actually.
Sadly.
So yeah, it just turns out our psychogenic illnesses are spreading via Twitter and Facebook. So it's all good. Or,
new methods.
TikTok too, right? Because they got all the dancing on the TikTok. So
that's a great point.
Yeah. We all get that dancing TikTok fever, whatever's viral, quote unquote, at the moment.
Which, not to do a huge aside, but isn't it weird that like TikTok dancing is not like real dancing? Like, you can see a TikTok dance and know it's a TikTok dance versus, like, if I was going out to a dance club or I was going out to learn a formal type of dance, it is completely separate. It's just so interesting to me.
It is. It's very choreographed. And could you imagine if these dancing plagues were as choreographed as a TikTok dance? They would probably be a lot more interesting. Or it looks like they're all doing, like, what is it, the game Fortnite, like, emotes? Which I think
that's true. Emotes. Interesting. But also, is this modern line dancing? That's my question.
Ooh, my God.
And the social media world, is this line dancing across the globe?
I think it might be. That might be a really good way, because it's got that cooperative element to it, right?
Yeah. And like one person does it, and then someone who follows them does it. It is viral.
It really is. It really is. I love this. If we're going to go off on a tangent, this is the right one to go on, I think.
To go back to your first episode, licentious behavior, lasciviousness,
perniciousness. And of course we have, again, demonic possession is probably the most well-known affliction. If anything can't be explained, especially mentally back then, it's a demon.
Well, and I think it's fair to say if you live in an empire called the Holy Roman Empire, which is effectively like the only ordained nation by the Catholic Church at that time. They're basically like, you are the recognized empire. You have to imagine those are going to be the explanations for a lot of behavior when you're living in that kind of environment.
Yes.
And to quote Voltaire as well as Linda Richmond, the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire.
Oh my God. I'm a bit verklempt.
What I learned in this is Voltaire basically said it, and that's the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Discuss. That's where that character. I didn't realize that came from Voltaire.
No, I didn't know that either. That's great. So did anybody actually say that the Civil War was neither civil nor war?
I'm gonna look that up. I feel like Benjamin Franklin may have said that. I don't know. He was dead by then. Never mind. He's a Revolutionary War. History. Public education for the win.
We know our things.
That was John F. Kennedy, I think, who lived during that time, right? JFK?
Yeah. He's a jelly donut. That we do know.
Ich bin ein... Hey, we are talking about old-timey Germany. Ich bin ein Berliner.
I do find it very interesting, and actually previous scholars that have studied these events note that these mania events happened mostly along towns that had the same water source, which I found interesting. They
fascinating.
So like the Rhine River and some other shared rivers, but through that part of Europe, I mean, it crossed across pretty much that whole continent. Over the centuries, they would have some isolated incident related to this. It's really interesting, right? Because then that causes a lot of people to think, oh, is it coming out of the water? Or is it coming from a food source? And that's very tempting on the surface, but you don't need to dig much deeper to realize that that's not how this works. So let's pull up the all-time fave, ergotism, which is ergot, which is a fungus that grows on rye, wheat, and other grains.
When it gets damp.
Yes, exactly. And it's been blamed for a lot of incidents throughout history, most notably the Salem witch trials. And that's also
another hysteria event.
Exactly. And I have a feeling that one will be in that particular season that we do here. But it's kind of too easy of an explanation, because the thing is, when you talk about a hallucinogen, which is what ergot is, it contains chemicals that actually served as the basis for LSD that was later developed by the CIA for MK Ultra. We'll get into that one at another time as well.
Put a pin in it.
Yeah. The thing about when you're tripping balls is that everybody kind of trips differently. It's not the same for everybody. You're either going to have a good trip, a bad trip, or somewhere in between. You're not going to get 650 people all doing the same thing.
Or the long-term nature of it, right? If this is going on, not that everyone did it for 2 months, but the fact that people are doing this day on end, week on end, like, I just don't think that if you look at the effects that ergot had on people, it can't explain the extent of this event or other events like it.
Yeah, and ergot poisoning also causes gangrenous limbs, which was not seen very commonly, if at all, through any of these events. So
ergo, not ergot.
Very well done. Exactly. That goes into the bin with the demonic possession. I do think, though, and perhaps this is my own little offshoot, and I will talk about demonic possession on another episode, I do very much feel that incidents of demonic possession have a similar root to things like this, in that it is a result in many ways of suggestion. So you don't necessarily have to believe in God or the devil to start having something that looks a lot like a demonic possession, because you are having your own individual hysteria event, psychosis rather. And that goes into, again, the somatoform disorders, conversion disorders, all these other disorders that can come to play when you are having one of these psychosis events, right? Which can explain why your brain has activated certain aspects that could tap into things we don't really understand yet, like why you might be able to speak a language you've never learned. Well, research has shown that when you're born, you have the capacity to know every language, and then you eventually prune that off as you grow older and focus on your main language that's in your household or what you're raised around, right?
That's right. Children are much better language learners than adults are.
Right. So you have that capacity, but we don't necessarily know what happens to those things that possibly go into deep storage. So when you are having one of these events, who knows what you could be tapping into? It's not necessarily supernatural. It is just a part of nature that we haven't quite figured out. They've even found that people who have been asleep in long comas have awoken to be able to do complex math, or, again, speak a language that they'd never learned before. There's something that happens in the rewiring of the brain that can gain access to things that you weren't consciously aware of previously. The brain is a giant gelatinous computer with a lot of networks that we just don't even know. I know that's an elegant way to put it, but I think it's how we can maybe start to understand some of these things without really needing to invoke a supernatural being. To me, that's just an easy explanation that glosses over it, I think, and discredits the amazing construction of this piece of meat in our skulls.
When I was in college, I took an intro psychology class before I ended up majoring in it. And that very first class, the professor came in, he opened his shirt and it said Star Trek. And he's like, the final frontier. He's like, but space is not the final frontier. The brain is. It's like we know more probably about the universe than we do about our brains. And the fact that we don't know much about the universe is a little interesting. Now, he may have been oversimplifying or exaggerating it, but the point is, even today, with all of the magnetic resonant imaging, like MRIs and the things that we're doing, we're like scratching the surface.
Oh, like PET scans. That's another one.
PET scans, CAT scans. Like there's a lot of ways that we can scan the brain. But the end result is that we know so little even now, even though we've made huge advances in the last couple of decades, we're still scratching the surface. And I think, and this is, I believe, a recurring theme because Alice and I have talked about this a lot. I think often we don't give enough credit to our brains and the power they have over us. We like to think we are the master of our domains. And to an extent, that's true. But to another extent, we're kind of fooling ourselves.
Oh, yeah. And that's another power of the brain. We're using it against ourselves without even realizing it. I mentioned this in a previous episode, this gulf between what we perceive and what is fact. And we want to jump over that gulf and just get right to it without any of the learning required, those stepping stones of knowledge between perception and reality. And taking those steps is hard. It requires us to pay attention and to read and to listen and to maybe change our feelings and perceptions on things that we were holding on to. And it's just so much easier to jump over all that and just either cling to what we have or just accept a completely other easy reality. Oh, the devil did it.
Everything we think and feel goes through a filter. We do not realize it, but that is what perception is. Everything we see, hear, like all of our senses, we're not experiencing sensation. We're experiencing perception. You know, from the moment a sensation touches one of your receptors, whether it's your finger or your ear, whatever, you are going through a process of interpretation. And I think this kind of goes into what we're talking about. It's a process called top-down, wherein you make sense of something based on your understanding of it. So for instance, if I make a piece of toast and it looks like a woman with like something on her head, I might be like, that's Virgin Mary. Oh my gosh. And this is a real event. Someone saw Virgin Mary and a piece of toast and people validated it. Well, guess what? You don't think it's Virgin Mary if you don't grow up in a culture that is not Christian. Right. And you don't know anything about that. If you're growing up on the other side of the world in a completely different culture with a completely different religion, thoughts, feelings, superstitions, whatever, you're not going to see that same thing. That's top-down processing, where your brain fills the gaps. And there's a historian, John Waller, and he says that I think a huge chunk of this comes down to, there was Saint Vitus. Did you see this, Allison?
Yes.
Saint Vitus.
Mm-hmm.
So he's a Catholic saint who people in the 16th century of Europe believed had the power to curse people with a dancing plague. So you have this belief in mind. Now you're going to compound it with a couple of things that we talked about already. Disease, famine, tearing through this city.
The stress of it.
Yeah. You're at the breaking point. All of these things kind of come together, and that's going to be the trigger for this stress-induced hysteria. There's a theory in psychology called vulnerability theory, and that is some people may have a predisposition to, let's say, schizophrenia, but it may only manifest itself if the right conditions in your environment come up, and that might be stress, that might be just difficulties in growing up, not having a parent or two. There's a lot of things that could happen in your world where when those right stressors are in place, you might develop schizophrenia, say in your late teens, early 20s, but another person who's predisposed may not. That's really, I think, what we're seeing here with this incident. At this time, there's a zeitgeist, if you will, that is affecting people's behavior.
And let's roll this into the present day, shall we? Because we may think that, oh, we're not seeing people doing this exact thing. But what sounds like could be related to a segment of the population that is experiencing some form of stress?
Oh.
Yes.
Pick me.
Yes, Chris, you have an answer already?
I do have an answer.
Okay.
I can sum it up in a few words. Dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. Oh, is that what you're looking for?
Well, I was hoping that line would come up in this episode, and you didn't let me down.
Yeah, I mean, come on. Who can't not mention it? Come on. That's the best mass hysteria quote ever.
It never gets better than that. Probably my favorite line from the entire movie of Ghostbusters.
I don't know why it's so good, but it really is. But to your actual point, I mean, the thing is we can think about things throughout time. And I think about this epidemic, and I don't know the full time period, but there was a time that you might be aware of where there were fainting couches because people, particularly women of an era, would get the vapors or they would be so distraught that they would faint. That doesn't happen now. No one's doing that now.
Their corsets around their midsections probably had a lot to do with that. I mean,
that's a piece, right?
Right. And even today, when you think about a group of people that feel, whether imagined or not, they feel on the brink to the point that they're going to do something completely irrational and they're going to harm themselves or other people. We hear about mass shootings in the news.
True.
Multiple times a month or a year, whatever. They seem to go through spades, but we think of these on an individual level. We think of it as one individual shooter going into a public place and killing a bunch of people before killing themselves most of the time or being killed by suicide by cop. But when you take it as a whole in terms of a population, it's very similar. It seems illogical, irrational, and horrific, and it keeps happening hundreds of times a year in this country. That says something about, again, the existential shit show.
Thank you.
That our culture is currently engaged in. It doesn't have to look like anything from a few hundred years ago. It's just that unique culminations of events triggering, for lack of a better word, factors that cause multiple people to engage in these sorts of events that result in death, destruction, what have you. They might not all be doing it simultaneously, but they feed off of one another. The same way that these people came outside their houses, saw dozens of people dancing in the streets, and either looked on and went, what the hell? Or they joined in. You look at somebody doing a mass shooting, somebody out there is watching it and going, yeah, that sounds like the way to go. Not just someone, multiple someones, and they're all going to do it at their own time. But I do feel like that is a relatable thing that we can look at today as like a contemporary example that might be a little different than this in terms of how it's staged. But when you look at how these events happened in this time period of Europe, between the 8th and the 17th or 18th century, and then you look at all the factors that they were dealing with, it kind of all starts to make some form of sense.
Yeah, and I think there's other examples. So I mentioned fainting spells, and to your point, there might be a physical reason for that because of the expectations of women at the time and what they should dress as. But these fainting spells happen in many areas of the world at different times. There's also a lot around ghosts and spirits. UFO sightings, think about it. No one really talks about them anymore, but that was the topic, particularly in the 50s, 60s, going into a couple decades after. Satanic Panic of the 70s and 80s. You have the Red Scare. You have witch trials, which we mentioned. There was an era of meowing nuns. Did you read about this? The meowing nuns?
No.
So that's interesting. There was a laughing epidemic.
I know about that one.
Somewhere in Africa, if I remember correctly. Was it Tanzania? Did I get that right?
It was Tanzania in the 1960s.
Okay. Yeah. And again, fairly recent, but you have a laughing epidemic. You have all of these things in which it's kind of the zeitgeist. What is going on at that time, which is affecting people. And some of the current events happen around environmental events.
Yes.
Think of it. We're kind of in an environmental crisis right now with climate change and all those kinds of things. And so you can imagine that this will manifest itself differently now than it did at a different time when spacecrafts and spies and all of these things are going on. And suddenly people think there are aliens flying ships in the sky and all these kinds of things, right? There's a time and again trend that keeps going on. And I think that to me is very fascinating. Does it sound cool that aliens are visiting us? Sure. Am I going to say they're not? No. But can I see that there is a specific zeitgeist that might make people think they're seeing a thing and that mass hysteria may be a piece of it? Absolutely.
And I feel like the type of craft that people are seeing, when they all start to see them at the same time, it relates back to something that was in development at the time that was being tested somewhere. They're not seeing flying saucers now. The people that are seeing spaceships now are seeing a completely different type of shape or phenomenon or something. And I find it highly interesting that the culture also affects the type of alien that they see. The aliens now don't look like the aliens then. And That's all influenced by whatever the popular culture has inserted into that collective consciousness. We are not immune to these things today, as we're all trying to say now. We can look at this and sort of remark on the absurdity of it. And it's kind of funny to think about until you really start to think about it. Then it's kind of terrifying. And it's also very sad. This is something that these people that were living a life that even now, in the challenges that we're facing today, we cannot really begin, I think, to understand. A lot of these people were watching their entire villages be gutted by plagues. We're talking 60, 70% of a city dead, bodies piled in the streets. These people who died, they died being covered in festering blisters, usually within days. Sometimes, depending on the type of plague, they got hours of infection. And then you have the wrecked economies, you have the wars, and then the famines. Yes, they had a 1,000-year drought. When a famine happened back then, you were going to starve to death. You really had to decide a lot of times which kid you were going to feed. That's how bad it was for most of that continent. And when you have like a limited amount of outlets and things, this idea of just going out into the streets and just dancing for that time, it just seems like, yeah, that makes some sense.
And you have to think on a smaller scale, right? Like if you're furious, what do? You punch something, your body, you might like just sort of tense up and your body kind of vibrates and you might just use your body to move out the energy, right?
Well, like Kevin Bacon in Footloose when he was punch dancing.
Obviously, Kevin Bacon is the best example. Let's be clear.
We could not do this show without bringing up Footloose. I am actually kind of sad that we made it this far in and didn't bring up Footloose yet.
I mean, let's be clear. Would you not want to dance in a town where dance was outlawed by a bunch of jerk parents? You kids can't dance. I'll show you.
Yeah. They should have brought John Lithgow in to ban the dancing. That really would have ended it, right?
John Lithgow, what a treasure. My goodness.
He really is. Had a lot of fun talking about him with Josh and Kelly on Press Play and Scream on a recent episode.
Oh, that's right.
He's a fearless god, is what we ended up calling him. That dude will do anything.
Well, to quote Latin, ergo, ergot, ego. That's fake Latin, everybody. But, we talked about ergot, and then I said ergo, and then ego. We're to ego. We're pairing the letters away, right?
Right.
This is really ego. I said, we think we're the masters of our domain. We think we are in full control of ourselves, and we're fooling ourselves. And I just feel like, to your point, Allison, I just don't think that things have changed that much in the sense, sure, we know more scientifically, but we're seeing playing out today, right now, in this current pandemic. Some of these things I think you can draw parallels to pretty easily without a lot of hard work because we've been living in the soup for 2 years now. And so I just think there's a little bit of this ego that we are above that we are in control of it, but our brains are going to tell us otherwise. Our bodies are going to tell us otherwise. And you just have to wonder if that's not also something that was going on back then, that, this whole idea, listen to your body, listen to what you're doing. And your mind wants to think, I can keep going, I can do this. But when the stressors pile up, the proverbial straw breaks the back, and all of a sudden it's just going to kind of explode out of you. And chances are you're not going to have any control of it.
We saw a little bit of this on January 6th, 2021. I would say that a lot of what descended onto the Capitol that day was a bit of a shared hysteria. And I'll back away from the politics on that. And I will also say it's not just that, but anytime, say, a favored sports team wins the big game, whether it's basketball, soccer, whatever, and the fans descend upon the streets and start turning cars over and setting things on fire. Again, when you get groups of people together with a shared enthusiasm for something, or shared lack of enthusiasm,
right,
or shared desperation, or just heightened emotion, you know, when things are just running high,
you're going to do something you would never do on your own.
Yes. And it's mob mentality. So that is a very real thing. You become part of one large moving organism. You are no longer an individual. And hearkening back again, saying January 6th, I think a lot of those people that showed up to that were there to protest. They were, you know, angry about the election, whatever. I don't think most of them, I don't think they anticipated that, yeah, I'm going to break into the Capitol building and I'm going to steal a podium. I'm sorry, a lectern. Sorry.
Right.
So I think that given some distance from it, I do feel that some of the people that were involved in that on the inside, they're probably going, what in the hell did I just do?
You see that with people who have been indicted for that event.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, whether it's theatrics or just pleading to the judge or the court, I don't think that's true. There is this sense of like, I don't know what overcame me. Like you hear that time and again, and you just have to wonder, that doesn't excuse any behavior.
Right.
On the other hand, you do understand it. There's a difference between understanding something and excusing it.
Right.
And I personally will not excuse anyone's behavior for doing something that is wrong. Like if you're caught up in a mob and you burn or flip over a car, you know, because your sports team won and you get arrested for it, sorry, Charlie, that is your business.
There was a point when you decided to join that mob, that was a conscious decision. And then once you make that choice, then anything that happens after that point is, you know, we base laws on this all the time. We aren't lawyers, obviously. We just have friends who are. But if, for instance, you get into a car with a group of people that say, hey, man, let's go rob this convenience store. And then one of the people in that car pulls out a gun and shoots the clerk. You're busted for murder just like they are because you're a part of it. And it's just like that. You might have not been in control of the person who shot the clerk. You made a conscious decision to join that group.
And even if you didn't consciously do it, like you could argue you didn't, you still did it. Like that's what it really comes down to. And so I just think it's the idea of understanding versus excusing. And you do kind of have to pay your due if you do something that is incorrect. And, you know, I just even think about, you know, I had mob mentality written down. So I'm so glad you mentioned that. And I also kind of made a connection to the Milgram studies at Yale around obedience and the fact that people would do something they would not normally do because they were told by an authority figure to do the thing, even when they were really distressed, even when this is, by the way, a study that would never pass muster these days.
No.
The IRB would I think it's Institutional Review Board, if I remember correctly, would never let that pass today. But in 1965 at Yale, of all places, this is not some unprestigious, air quotes, university, 'tis Yale. They were effectively tormenting people. And they got away with it because people submitted to the authority figure.
Yes.
It was obedience. And you have to wonder at some point, is that a factor in something like what happened in Strasbourg or these other events that we're talking about? Not that authority figure said, thou must dance, but if I'm somewhere and this has been going on in my town for a month and suddenly the town is like, we're erecting the stage, bringing in professional dancers and musicians, is there not perhaps some implication that I should be doing this too? That this is validating the behavior?
And that's what it did because people did join. And there is very much something to be said about FOMO, which is what we call it today. They didn't know that back then. But
actually, I looked it up. I think Latin is FOMO for...
Yeah. More FOMO, ego, ergo, ergot, FOMO.
Ego, ergot, ego, FOMO. Yeah, exactly.
Most common example right now is probably Wordle. I resisted Wordle for weeks and then finally got into it.
I mean, that was what, Candy Crush? And wasn't there like a mob game back in the day, and like Farmville? There were so many of these games. Like, these are other more innocuous, but still great examples of people getting into this mob mentality, or the I want to be involved in this too. I mean, just think about clapping. This is very basic, right? If someone's in a room and claps, a lot of other people start clapping, even if you don't know why. Like, there's just something about it where you're feeling like you have to join in on this thing. You're kind of being, you're conforming, right? And I just even think of these weird things that happen in the way we talk. The transatlantic accent, which Allison and I both love. Like, how's it going there, darling? Ring-a-ding-ding. Where did that come from?
Yeah.
It was just a thing people did, and then it was gone. Right now, we are in a very challenging time, I will say, of vocal fry. I find myself doing it. I was listening to myself on my other podcast, 80s High, please listen. Shameless plug. Where I was like doing the vocal fry, and it drove me crazy. And I may have even done it on your podcast. I'm not even trying to do it.
I've done it on my podcast. I'm doing it. Yeah.
We don't even know it. Like, both of us do not like the trend, and yet somehow we're doing it and hearing other people do it. Well, where does that come from? Again, there's just something about how societies operate where we unknowingly conform to kind of what's going on around us.
Yes.
However it starts and wherever it goes, we're somehow along for the ride.
We are slaves to one another. We will never be apart. I'm talking about just you and me, Chris. Just you and me. No one else.
I thought that was a Britney Spears song, but okay, please go on.
I love all the potential rabbit holes that this episode has presented, because honestly, so many things that we have brought up are going to be future episodes on this show. These are topics that I am deeply fascinated by and invested in. The sociological aspects of so many psychological phenomenon and how people behave in groups. That is a topic that just gets me to my core. It is something that I think pulls me into the direction of loving true crime as much as I do, and studying psychology. Chris majored in it. He graduated. I majored in it, didn't graduate, but we both have very much a shared love of it. And I think we are probably drawn to it because we want to understand not only why other people are the way they are, but maybe why we are the way we are. I tend to probe very much these topics, and I love that this episode has served as the opening salvo, in a sense, for many of the seasons to come on this show. And I love that you're along for the ride, man. This has been an amazing first season, I think, because it's my first season. I did the thing. I did a season of this show.
You did the thing, which is amazing. And also, I'm just so excited to see, like, I kind of have a sneak peek of what's going to happen next season. And just all of the things that we keep talking about, we're like, put it on the list, put it on the list, put it on the list. Like, even if I'm not in those episodes, I want to listen to them because these are just fascinating topics. And I made a terrible joke, I think in season 1, about ding dong bummer times. And I do feel like sometimes we're like, I told Allison this, like, are we stealing the magic from what's going on? But the fact that our brains are doing this and we're not even aware of it, and it's our own brains, that's interesting. And if you think you need some external ghost or spirit or whatever to be driving what you do, I don't want to diminish that, but that doesn't mean that the very fascinating things that we do as humans, even if you can scientifically explain them, isn't still very perplexing and amazing and like awe-inspiring.
I feel like there will never be an end to the amount of things that we can explore about things we thought we knew about ourselves and the things we are continuing to learn about ourselves as we are faced with newer and more evolving challenges. I often find some comfort, though, in studying the past, these events, for instance, and the Black Plagues, and that whole era of human history, and finding so many parallels to what we're facing now. I find that a comfort because it's just nice to know we've always been this fucked up. We're not completely inventing it. If anything, we're just making it more easily passed around the globe because we can communicate as we are now. We're 3,000 miles apart, Chris, and yet here we are.
I mean, you have to even think the people of 1518 were like, those rubes from 500 don't know crap, right? Like they just thought they knew everything.
And of course, as we said back in the first episode, the kids these days with their mixolydians and their harpsichords.
And their zither playing.
Yes, it's all very much in that same vein. The more things change, the more they stay the same. And with that in mind, go and listen to your favorite tune and try not to dance too hard to it. Just
don't dance to death. Like we're here to tell you right now, don't do that.
I can think of so many other ways I'd rather die.
Laughing to death, like the laughing hysteria. If I laugh to death, I think that would be a better way to go. If I'm going to be consumed by a hysteria, laughter.
Yeah.
It is the best medicine, everybody.
It really is.
Ask any doctor. 9 out of 10 physicians will agree. Laughter is the best medicine after all.
While the doctor is smoking a cigarette.
Yeah. I smoke the cool, filterless Camel cigarettes. Yeah. Oh, the 50s.
Oh, yes. Yes. Well, guys, thank you so much for being here. If you've been here from the beginning, double thank you, because anybody who gets on the ground floor of this thing, you're the true believers, and I hope to keep you around for a very long time. And if you're new to this and this is where you're starting, please go back and listen to the earlier episodes of this to get some even more interesting info. And then when you're done, please go listen to Chris's podcast, 80s High. It is just this fantastic, lovely trip of nostalgia from a decade that, well, Chris and I remember pretty well.
For sure.
And Ben, Chris's co-host. But some of you might not. And maybe you want to get a sense of why we are the way we are. And we will see you again with the next season with so many more great things to come. Peace out. Ding dong. Bye.
Stay awesome, everybody.
Ding Dong Darkness Time has been brought to you and produced by yours truly, Allison Dickson. It was made possible by an array of amazing co-hosts, friends, family, but especially you, the listeners. Big shouts also go out to the brilliant Nathaniel Dickson for the show art and future legend Spencer Morelock for all the music. I'll be back again soon with another episode. In the meantime, be good, you little ding dongs.